The first trucks rolled through the checkpoint at 1 minute past midnight on May 12, 1949. Soviet guards, who for 11 months had turned back every vehicle attempting to reach West Berlin, now stepped aside without a word. But standing in the cold Berlin darkness, watching those first headlights pierce the gloom, former Luftwaffe Colonel Hans-Detlef Herhudt von Roden felt something more complex than relief. He felt the weight of a question that had haunted him for nearly a year. How had the Americans done what his own Air Force, at the height of German military power, had failed to accomplish? The answer lay not in a single moment of triumph, but in the accumulation of 277,000 flights, each one a small defiance of what von Roden and every other military professional in Europe had believed possible. They had watched the Americans attempt something that violated every principle of military logistics, every lesson learned from the failures at Stalingrad and Demyansk, and they had watched, with growing disbelief, as the impossible became routine. This is the story of how American air power, 3 years after defeating Germany, returned to save it, and how the men who had once commanded the Luftwaffe learned that everything they thought they knew about air operations was wrong. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The morning of June 24, 1948, began with silence. Not the peaceful silence of a city at rest, but the sudden, terrible silence of a city cut off from the world. In the western sectors of Berlin, 2.5 million people woke to find their city transformed into an island, surrounded by 300,000 Soviet troops, and sealed off from all land and water routes to the west. Like Deputy Mayor Ferdinand Friedensberg, the Soviet blockade brought back memories they had tried to forget. Friedensberg had lived through the final months of the war, when Berlin had been reduced to rubble by the very bombers that now, theoretically, might be the city's only lifeline. The irony was almost unbearable. The Americans and British, who had spent years destroying Berlin from the air, were now being asked to save it by the same method. But Friedensberg understood something that the Soviet leadership apparently did not. He had studied the failed German airlift operations of the war. He had read the after-action reports from Stalingrad, where the Luftwaffe had promised Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus it could deliver 500 tons of supplies per day to the encircled Sixth Army. The Luftwaffe had averaged barely 90 tons per day, and Paulus's army had starved and frozen before surrendering. Friedensberg knew the mathematics of airlift. He knew that Berlin needed a minimum of 4,000 tons of supplies per day to survive food, coal, medicine, raw materials for its factories. No air force in history had ever sustained such a flow. The Soviet calculation seemed obvious. The Western Allies would attempt an airlift, fail within a matter of weeks, and withdraw from Berlin in humiliation. Joseph Stalin, who had been a master of siege warfare since the 1920s, understood starvation as a weapon. He had used it in Ukraine, in Leningrad, in a dozen other places where populations had been starved into submission. Berlin would be no different. In the first days after the blockade began, the Western response seemed to confirm Soviet expectations. The initial airlift operations were, by any measure, chaotic. American transport aircraft, primarily C-47 Skytrains, the military version of the Douglas DC-3, began flying into Berlin's Tempelhof Airport, carrying whatever cargo could be scrounged from depots across occupied Germany. British planes, a mixture of Dakotas and older bombers converted to cargo use, flew into Gatow Airfield in the British sector. In those first days, the combined Allied effort delivered barely 90 tons per day. German observers, many of them former Luftwaffe officers now working in civilian roles, watched with a mixture of hope and professional skepticism. Major General Hans-Georg von Tempelhof, who had served as a staff officer in the Luftwaffe's Transport Command during the war, made his own calculations. The Americans had perhaps 200 transport aircraft available in Europe. Each C-47 could carry about 3 tons of cargo. Even flying at maximum capacity, with perfect weather and no mechanical failures, the mathematics simply didn't work. Von Tempelhof gave the airlift 3 weeks before the Americans admitted defeat. What von Tempelhof and other German military professionals failed to account for was something that had no precedent in European military history: the sheer industrial capacity of the United States and its willingness to mobilize that capacity for a non-shooting war. Within days of the blockade, President Harry S. Truman made a decision that would reshape the entire operation. He ordered the deployment of additional aircraft to Europe, not dozens, but hundreds. C-54 Skymasters, the 4-engine military version of the Douglas DC-4, began arriving at American air bases in western Germany. Each C-54 could carry 10 tons of cargo, more than 3 times the capacity of a C-47, and unlike the C-47s, which were needed for operations worldwide, the C-54s were pulled from training commands, from transport squadrons across the United States, from anywhere they could be found. The man responsible for organizing this growing fleet was Lieutenant General Curtis LeMay, commander of United States Air Forces in Europe. LeMay, who had directed the strategic bombing campaign against Japan, understood air operations at scale. But even LeMay initially doubted whether an airlift could sustain an entire city. He assigned the task to one of his transport commanders, Brigadier General Joseph Smith, with instructions to do the best he could for as long as the operation lasted. For the first 2 months, the best he could meant barely enough to keep Berlin from immediate starvation. July of 1948 saw average daily deliveries of 2,000 tons, half what the city needed. Berliners went on strict rations. Electricity was available for only 4 hours per day, divided into unpredictable shifts that forced families to wake in the middle of the night to use their appliances when power briefly flowed. Coal, desperately needed for the coming winter, was almost non-existent. In the Soviet sector of Berlin, propaganda loudspeakers broadcast a simple message: register for food rations in the east, where the Soviet Union could supply its people by rail and truck. Tens of thousands of West Berliners made the daily trip across the sector boundary to collect better rations. The airlift, Soviet broadcasters announced, was a propaganda stunt that would fail within weeks. And then something changed. The Americans, with characteristic disregard for established military doctrine, decided to treat the airlift not as a temporary emergency measure, but as a permanent industrial operation. In late July of 1948, the command of the airlift passed from General Smith to Major General William H. Turner. And with that change came a transformation that would astonish every military professional who witnessed it. Turner was not a combat pilot. He had never flown a bombing mission or engaged an enemy aircraft. His expertise lay in something far less glamorous but infinitely more complex: the industrial organization of air transport. During the war, Turner commanded the India-China division of the Air Transport Command, which flew supplies over the Himalayas from India to China, a route known as the Hump. It was the most dangerous air route in the world, crossing mountain peaks over 20,000 feet high in aircraft not designed for such altitudes, through weather that could destroy a plane in minutes. In 3 years of operations, the Hump airlift had lost nearly 600 aircraft and over 1,000 crew members. But it had also, at its peak, delivered 71,000 tons of supplies per month across those mountains. Turner looked at the Berlin Airlift and saw not a military operation but a production line, and he set about reorganizing it with the same principles that had made American factories the most productive in the world. The first thing Turner did was standardize everything. Every C-54 would carry exactly the same load, packed exactly the same way. Ground crews would know, before a plane landed, precisely what cargo it carried and exactly how long unloading would take. Pilots would fly the same route, at the same altitude, at the same speed, every single time. There would be no variation, no improvisation, no individual initiative that might disrupt the flow. To German observers, particularly former Luftwaffe officers, this approach seemed insane. German military doctrine emphasized individual skill, the ability of commanders to adapt to changing circumstances, and the importance of flexibility in the face of enemy action. But Tunner understood something that the German military tradition had never fully grasped. When you are moving thousands of tons of cargo across hundreds of miles, every single day, predictability is more valuable than brilliance. The flight pattern Turner established became known as the ladder. Aircraft would enter one of 3 air corridors from Western Germany to Berlin, flying at assigned altitudes separated by 500 feet. They would descend in a long, steady glide path to one of Berlin's airports, land, taxi to unloading areas where German workers waited, spend exactly 30 minutes on the ground, and then depart via a different corridor. If a pilot missed his approach, he was not allowed to circle and try again. That would disrupt the aircraft behind him. Instead, he had to return to Western Germany with his full load and get back in line. It was brutally efficient, and it worked. By late August of 1948, the airlift was delivering 3,000 tons per day. By September, 4,000 tons. The numbers that former Luftwaffe officers had calculated as impossible were becoming routine. Colonel von Roden, watching the aircraft flow into Tempelhof Airport in an endless stream, found himself mentally comparing what he was witnessing to the Luftwaffe's transport operations during the war. The contrast was devastating. German airlift operations had always been improvised, temporary measures conducted with whatever aircraft could be scraped together. The Junkers Ju-52, the Luftwaffe's primary transport aircraft, could carry 2 tons of cargo, 1/5 the capacity of a C-54. More importantly, Germany had never had enough of them. At Stalingrad, the Luftwaffe had committed every available transport aircraft and still failed. The Americans were now operating more transport aircraft over Berlin than the entire Luftwaffe had possessed at any point in the war. But it wasn't just the number of aircraft. It was the systematic nature of the operation, the way the Americans had turned air transport into an industrial process. German ground crews during the war had been well trained and dedicated, but they had worked with hand tools and muscle power. At Tempelhof, von Roden watched as American-designed cargo handling equipment, forklifts, conveyor systems, specialized loading trucks reduced unloading time to a fraction of what German crews had achieved, and the German workers doing the unloading, many of them former Luftwaffe ground crew, worked with an intensity that came from knowing their own survival depended on the efficiency of each operation. By October of 1948, something remarkable was happening. The airlift was no longer just sustaining Berlin, it was beginning to build up reserves. Warehouses that had been empty in July now held weeks' worth of flour and dried vegetables. Coal stocks, though still inadequate for winter, were growing. The psychological impact on Berliners was profound. The drone of aircraft engines, once the sound of approaching death, had become the sound of life itself. Former German military men struggled to understand what they were witnessing. General von Tempelhof revised his estimates repeatedly, each time pushing back his predicted collapse date for the airlift. But more than the statistics, what troubled him was the casual competence with which the Americans approached the impossible. There was no drama, no sense of heroic struggle. The pilots flew their routes like bus drivers following a schedule. The ground crews loaded and unloaded cargo with the bored efficiency of factory workers. The whole operation had the feel of routine, and that routine was accomplishing what German military science had declared impossible. In November, winter arrived, and with it came the real test. Coal consumption in Berlin skyrocketed as temperatures dropped below freezing. The minimum daily requirement jumped to 5,000 tons, and much of that had to be coal-heavy, bulky, and difficult to handle. Former Luftwaffe officers, who had seen German transport operations collapse in winter weather, waited for the American airlift to falter. Instead, it accelerated. Tunner's systematic approach meant that weather, while it slowed operations, never stopped them. The Americans had invested in ground-controlled approach radar systems at all 3 Berlin airports, technology that the Luftwaffe had possessed only in experimental form. Aircraft could land in fog so thick that pilots couldn't see the runway until seconds before touchdown. When ice formed on wings, there were de-icing procedures and equipment in place. When engines failed, and they failed regularly in the brutal cold, there were spare parts pre-positioned at every airfield and maintenance crews working in heated hangars around the clock. The contrast with German wartime operations was instructive. When the Luftwaffe had attempted to supply Stalingrad in the winter of 1942–43, the cold had been catastrophic. Aircraft engines froze overnight. Ground crews, without proper equipment or shelter, worked in temperatures that caused frostbite within minutes. Spare parts were unavailable because the German logistics system, stretched to breaking across the entire Eastern Front, couldn't prioritize airlift support. The operation had been a collection of individual acts of courage and sacrifice that collectively achieved almost nothing. The American airlift was the opposite, a system so robust that individual failures didn't matter. If one aircraft broke down, another took its place. If one pilot was exhausted, another was ready. If one airport was briefly closed by weather, traffic shifted to the other two. The system absorbed shocks that would have destroyed a less organized operation. By December of 1948, the airlift was delivering an average of 4,500 tons per day, more than Berlin's minimum requirement. The psychological impact on both sides of the Cold War divide was immense. For Berliners, the constant drone of aircraft became a symbol of Western commitment. For the Soviets, it became clear that the blockade was not forcing the Western Allies out of Berlin. If anything, it was strengthening their resolve and demonstrating their capabilities to the world. But for German military professionals, particularly those who had served in the Luftwaffe, the airlift prompted deeper questions about the nature of modern warfare and the sources of military power. Everything they had been taught, everything they had believed about air operations, was being contradicted by what they witnessed daily over Berlin. The Luftwaffe doctrine, inherited from the First World War and refined in the 1930s, had emphasized the offensive use of air power, bombers and fighters engaged in direct combat with the enemy. Transport aviation had always been secondary, something to be improvised when needed but never the focus of serious planning or investment. The idea that air transport could be not just a supporting capability, but a decisive weapon in a geopolitical struggle would have seemed absurd to the men who had planned the Luftwaffe's operations. Yet here it was, happening over the ruins of their capital. The Americans were winning a confrontation with the Soviet Union not through combat, but through the systematic delivery of coal and flour, and they were doing it with a level of organizational competence and industrial support that exposed fundamental differences between American and German approaches to warfare. Colonel von Roden, in his private journal, wrote of his growing realization that German military thinking had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern war. The Germans had fetishized combat, the clash of arms, the individual skill of pilots and commanders. The Americans had industrialized war, turning it into a problem of production, logistics, and systematic organization. At Stalingrad, the Luftwaffe had sent its most skilled pilots to fly transport missions, and they had failed because skill couldn't overcome inadequate aircraft, insufficient numbers, and chaotic organization. Over Berlin, the Americans were succeeding with average pilots flying routine missions in overwhelming numbers with systematic support. The implications were disturbing. If this was the future of warfare, not glorious combat but industrial competition, then Germany, with its limited resources and smaller industrial base, had been doomed from the start. The heroic narratives of individual German pilots achieving impossible victories against numerical odds, narratives that had sustained Luftwaffe morale throughout the war, suddenly seemed like self-deception. The Americans hadn't needed heroes. They needed production lines, organizational systems, and enough resources to make the impossible routine. As winter gave way to spring in 1949, the airlift had settled into a rhythm that defied all predictions. But General Turner was not satisfied with merely meeting Berlin's needs. He wanted to demonstrate, beyond any doubt, that the airlift could exceed any demand the Soviets might imagine. He wanted to break the Soviets' will not through gradual success, but through an overwhelming display of capability. The opportunity came with the Easter holiday. Turner announced to his staff that on Easter Sunday, April 17, 1949, the airlift would attempt to deliver the maximum tonnage possible in a single 24-hour period. Every available aircraft would fly. Every crew would be mobilized. Ground crews would work continuous shifts. The goal was not just to break records, but to demonstrate that the limit of American capability was far beyond what the Soviets had thought possible. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Colonel von Roden received word of the planned effort through his contacts in the Berlin city administration. His first reaction was skepticism. The Americans had been averaging around 5,000 tons per day for weeks, a remarkable achievement, but one that required the entire system operating at near maximum capacity. Turner was proposing to double that figure in a single day. Von Roden had seen German military planners make similar ambitious claims during the war, promises that had always collapsed when confronted with the friction of actual operations. Easter Sunday dawned clear over Berlin, and from the first hours of morning, the sky filled with aircraft in a density that seemed impossible. At Tempelhof Airport, a C-54 landed every 62 seconds, hour after hour. At Gatow and Tegel, the French-built airport in their sector, the pattern was the same, an endless stream of aircraft, each one touching down, unloading, and departing with mechanical precision. German workers at the airports, many of them veterans of the Luftwaffe's ground crews, had never seen anything like it. The Luftwaffe, at its peak, during the Battle of Britain or the early campaigns in the East, had never achieved this density of operations, and those had been combat missions, where aircraft scattered across the sky in loose formations. This was different, a precise choreography of hundreds of aircraft following identical flight paths with minimal separation, each one dependent on the one ahead, maintaining exact speed and altitude. Former Luftwaffe Captain Werner Flade, now working as a cargo supervisor at Tempelhof, watched the operation with professional fascination. He had served in transport squadrons during the war and had seen what happened when German airlift operations were pushed beyond their limits: aircraft collisions, runway pile-ups, cargo left unloaded because ground crews couldn't keep pace. He expected to see the same failures as the American operation accelerated beyond sustainable levels. Instead, he saw something that challenged his understanding of what air operations could achieve. The American ground control system, using radar and radio communications that the Luftwaffe had never possessed in such completeness, managed the flow of aircraft with extraordinary precision. When one pilot's approach was slightly off, he was waved off immediately and directed to return to base, no exceptions, no second attempts that might disrupt the carefully timed sequence. The loss of that single load was acceptable because maintaining the rhythm of the overall operation was paramount. The cargo handling impressed Flade even more. At each unloading point, teams of German workers organized into specialized squads, each trained for specific types of cargo, worked with assembly line efficiency. Coal came off one set of aircraft, flour from another, dried vegetables from a third. Specialized equipment that Flade had never seen during his Luftwaffe service, electric forklifts, conveyor belts, palletized loading systems, reduced the physical labor and increased speed. The Americans had studied time and motion efficiency with the same intensity that German engineers had once studied aircraft performance. By mid-afternoon, it was clear that the operation was succeeding beyond even Tunner's ambitious goals. Aircraft were landing so frequently that the noise became a continuous roar, punctuated only by brief moments of relative quiet when the wind shifted. Berliners gathered at the airport fences and in the streets around Tempelhof, watching history being made. For many, the emotional impact was overwhelming. The Americans, who had bombed their city into rubble just 4 years earlier, were now mounting the largest humanitarian operation in history to save them. When the 24 hours ended, the tally was almost unbelievable: 12,940 tons, delivered in 1,398 flights. It was more than twice the city's daily requirement, more than Germany's entire Luftwaffe had ever delivered in a single day to any location during the entire war, and it had been accomplished without a single serious accident, without chaos, with nothing more dramatic than the systematic execution of detailed plans. General von Tempelhof, studying the figures that evening, experienced something close to despair. He had spent his career in the Luftwaffe believing that German military professionalism, German technical expertise, and German organizational skill were superior to anything the Americans could achieve. The stereotype, widely held among German officers, was that Americans were wealthy but militarily naive, capable of overwhelming enemies with resources but lacking the sophistication for truly complex operations. The Easter demonstration destroyed that comfortable myth. What the Americans had accomplished required not just resources but extraordinary organizational sophistication. Every element of the operation: flight planning, cargo loading, ground control, maintenance scheduling, crew rotation had been optimized with a level of systematic analysis that exceeded anything in German military practice. The Americans had treated the airlift as an engineering problem and solved it with methods borrowed from industrial production. It was a form of military excellence that German military culture, with its emphasis on heroic leadership and individual initiative, had never fully developed. The psychological impact on Soviet leadership was equally profound, though they would never publicly admit it. Marshal Vasily Sokolovsky, the Soviet military governor of Germany, had assured Stalin that the blockade would force the Western Allies to choose between abandoning Berlin or accepting Soviet terms for reunification. The Easter demonstration made clear that a third option existed. The Americans could simply ignore the blockade, supplying Berlin indefinitely through air power alone. Soviet military analysts studying the operation came to disturbing conclusions. The Americans had demonstrated a capability for sustained logistics operations that the Soviet Union could not match. The entire Soviet military doctrine was based on land warfare, on the ability to mass force at decisive points and overwhelm the enemy. But what did you do when the enemy could simply fly over your forces, when your ability to control territory meant nothing against an adversary who could supply cities from the air? More troubling still was what the airlift revealed about American industrial capacity. The aircraft flying into Berlin represented only a fraction of American air transport capability. During the war, the United States had produced more than 10,000 C-47s alone, along with thousands of other transport aircraft. American factories had built over 300,000 aircraft of all types during the war years, more than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. That industrial power had not disappeared with the war's end. The airlift demonstrated that it could be mobilized for peacetime purposes with the same systematic efficiency that had characterized American war production. For the Soviet leadership, the implications were clear. A direct military confrontation with the United States would be a disaster. The Red Army might have numerical superiority in Europe, but numbers meant little if the Americans could supply forces by air, could bomb Soviet positions with impunity, could mobilize their industrial base to produce whatever was needed. The blockade, intended to demonstrate Soviet power, had instead revealed its limitations. In late April of 1949, Soviet diplomats began signaling willingness to negotiate. The public position remained defiant, but behind the scenes, Stalin was looking for a way to end the blockade without admitting defeat. The Americans, recognizing the opening, engaged in careful diplomatic discussions that allowed both sides to claim partial victory while ending the confrontation. The formal agreement, reached in early May, was deliberately vague on most points. The Soviets agreed to lift all restrictions on ground transportation to Berlin. The Western Allies agreed to participate in a Council of Foreign Ministers meeting to discuss the German question. Neither side acknowledged that the blockade had failed or that the airlift had succeeded officially. It was simply time to try a different approach. But everyone involved understood the reality. The blockade had been a test of wills and capabilities, and the Soviets had lost. On May 12, 1949, at 1 minute past midnight, the first trucks rolled through Soviet checkpoints into West Berlin. The blockade was over. The airlift, however, continued. General Clay, the American military governor, insisted on maintaining operations at full capacity for several more months to build up stockpiles and demonstrate that the lifting of the blockade was not a victory for the Soviets, but simply the removal of an inconvenience. Through the summer of 1949, aircraft continued their rhythmic flow into Berlin, accumulating reserves of food and coal that would sustain the city for months, even if another blockade were imposed. For the German people of Berlin, and particularly for those who had served in the military, the airlift's end brought complex emotions. Relief, certainly the immediate crisis was over. gratitude toward the Americans and British who had saved their city, but also a profound sense of historical irony that was impossible to ignore. Ernst Reuter, the mayor of West Berlin, captured some of this complexity in a speech given at Tempelhof Airport in September of 1949, as the airlift operations finally began to wind down. Reuter, a social democrat who had opposed the Nazis and spent the war years in exile, spoke to a crowd of thousands of Berliners and hundreds of American airmen. 3 years ago, Reuter said, "Aircraft flew over this city carrying death. Today, aircraft fly over this city carrying life. This transformation is not just about changing circumstances, it is about changing relationships, changing understanding, changing what we believe about each other and about ourselves." Reuter's words resonated deeply with the German military veterans in the crowd. They had fought against the Americans with skill and courage, had inflicted casualties and won battles, had believed themselves to be defending their homeland against enemies who sought Germany's destruction. And they had lost, utterly and completely, to an enemy whose industrial power and organizational capacity they had fundamentally underestimated. Now, those same enemies were saving German lives through an operation that demonstrated capabilities the German military had never possessed. The cognitive dissonance was painful but necessary. Understanding what the airlift revealed about American power required confronting uncomfortable truths about German military culture and the myths that had sustained it. Colonel von Roden, in the months after the blockade ended, began writing a systematic analysis of the airlift for a small circle of former Luftwaffe officers. His goal was not to criticize individuals or assign blame, but to understand what the airlift revealed about the nature of modern warfare and why Germany had failed so completely to develop similar capabilities. His analysis focused on 3 fundamental areas where German military culture had proven inadequate: industrial mobilization, systematic organization, and the relationship between military and civilian spheres. On industrial mobilization, von Roden noted that Germany had entered the war with a peacetime economy and had never fully transitioned to total war production until 1943, far too late. Even at peak production, German industry had operated with craft production methods, emphasizing quality over quantity, producing sophisticated weapons in limited numbers rather than adequate weapons in overwhelming numbers. The Americans had done the opposite, designing weapons that were good enough and then producing them in quantities that made individual quality almost irrelevant. The C-54 Skymaster, von Roden noted, was not a particularly sophisticated aircraft. It was slower than some German transports, less maneuverable, lacking in many refinements that German engineers would have considered essential. But it was reliable, easy to maintain, and most importantly, produced in sufficient numbers that losses didn't matter. The Americans had built more than 1,000 of them during and immediately after the war. The Luftwaffe's best transport aircraft, the Junkers Ju 290, had been produced in quantities of less than 200, and was so maintenance-intensive that availability rates were always poor. On systematic organization, von Roden's analysis was even more critical of German practice. The Luftwaffe had prided itself on the skill and initiative of its commanders, on the ability to adapt to changing circumstances through clever improvisation. But the airlift demonstrated that for sustained operations, systematic planning and rigid adherence to procedure were more effective than individual brilliance. General Tunner's achievement, von Roden wrote, was not tactical genius, but organizational excellence. He had analyzed the problem of supplying Berlin, broken it down into component parts, optimized each part individually, and then integrated them into a system that was greater than the sum of its parts. There was no room in Tunner's system for heroic improvisation, indeed. Such improvisation would have disrupted the carefully planned flow. What was needed was not heroes but competent professionals executing established procedures. The German military tradition, von Roden argued, had never fully embraced this industrial approach to warfare. Even late in the war, when Germany was clearly losing, Luftwaffe operations emphasized the individual achievements of aces, the brilliant tactical victories that made no strategic difference. The Americans had abandoned such romanticism, treating warfare as a problem of production and logistics to be solved through systematic analysis. Finally, On the relationship between military and civilian spheres, von Roden noted that the airlift's success depended on capabilities that existed in American and civilian industry and were simply adapted for military use. The cargo handling equipment, the maintenance procedures, the systematic approach to scheduling and flow management, all of these had civilian origins in American factories, railroads, and logistics companies. The American military could draw on a deep well of civilian expertise in industrial organization. Germany, by contrast, had maintained a sharp separation between military and civilian spheres. The military was a world unto itself, with its own culture, its own methods, its own sense of superiority to civilian life. This separation meant that the military couldn't easily draw on civilian expertise, couldn't adopt civilian innovations, couldn't benefit from the systematic organization that characterized the best American industries. The result, von Roden concluded, was that Germany had fought the Second World War with a military that was tactically excellent but strategically inadequate. German soldiers, pilots, and commanders had been individually superior to their American counterparts in many cases. But individual superiority meant nothing when confronted with systematic organization, overwhelming industrial production, and the ability to sustain operations indefinitely through superior logistics. Von Roden's analysis circulated among former Luftwaffe officers and contributed to a broader reassessment of German military history that would continue for decades. But for most Berliners, both civilian and former military, the lessons of the airlift were more immediate and personal. Werner Flade, the former Luftwaffe captain who had worked as a cargo supervisor during the airlift, found himself confronting a simple truth. The Americans had saved his life and the lives of his family. His daughter, born during the blockade winter, had survived because American pilots had flown coal through winter storms so that Berlin's hospitals could maintain heat. His wife had not starved because American ground crews had loaded flour onto aircraft around the clock. These were not abstract, strategic considerations, but concrete, personal realities. And yet Flade had spent 3 years of the war trying to kill Americans, had flown missions transporting ammunition and supplies to German forces fighting American troops, had considered himself to be defending his country against an enemy bent on Germany's destruction. The transformation from enemy to savior, from occupier to benefactor, required a psychological adjustment that was difficult to articulate but impossible to avoid. Many Berliners experienced this adjustment through small daily interactions with American aircrews. The pilots and loadmasters who flew the airlift missions were, for the most part, young men who had served in the war and felt no particular animosity toward Germans. They were doing a job, following orders, but they were also aware that they were helping people who desperately needed help. The most famous example of this personal connection was Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen, the candy bomber, whose gesture of dropping candy on small parachutes to Berlin's children became a symbol of American generosity. Halvorsen's operation, which started as an individual initiative and grew into an organized effort involving dozens of pilots and thousands of donations from America, demonstrated something important about American military culture that differed profoundly from German tradition. In the Luftwaffe, an officer who deviated from orders to undertake a personal humanitarian initiative would have faced severe discipline. Military operations were serious business, not to be complicated by sentimental gestures. But in the American military, Halvorsen's initiative was celebrated, encouraged, and expanded. The American command understood that the airlift was not just a logistical operation, but a psychological and political one, and that small gestures of kindness toward German children served strategic purposes as effectively as tons of delivered cargo. For German military veterans watching this, the contrast was instructive. The Americans fought wars with a pragmatism that Germans had never fully understood, where German military culture emphasized honor, duty, and sacrifice abstract values that existed apart from practical consequences. American military culture seemed focused on achieving concrete objectives through whatever means proved effective. If dropping candy to children helped win German hearts and minds, then dropping candy was a legitimate military operation, worthy of coordination and support. This pragmatism extended to the broader strategic purpose of the airlift. The Americans and British were not saving Berlin out of pure humanitarian concern. They were saving Berlin because a successful blockade would have represented a major Cold War victory for the Soviet Union and would have undermined West's credibility throughout Europe. The humanitarian dimension was real and deeply felt by many of the individuals involved, but it existed within a framework of hard, strategic calculation. For Ernst Reuter and other German democratic leaders, this American combination of pragmatism and idealism offered a model for Germany's future. The Americans believed in democracy not as an abstract ideal, but as a practical system of government that produced better outcomes than authoritarianism. They supported German recovery not out of charity, but because a prosperous, democratic West Germany would be a stronger ally against Soviet expansion. This unsentimental approach to international relations was something new in German experience, and it suggested possibilities for a different kind of national identity. The Federal Republic of Germany, established in May of 1949 just as the blockade was ending, embodied this new direction. The Basic Law, Germany's new constitution, emphasized democratic procedure, civil liberties, and integration with Western Europe rather than assertions of national greatness or military power. Former Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe officers, watching this new Germany take shape, had to confront the possibility that the militaristic nationalism that had defined German identity for generations had been not just morally wrong, but strategically counterproductive. The airlift became a founding myth for this new Germany, a story that illustrated what the country could be when it aligned itself with democratic values and Western partnership, rather than pursuing national greatness through military power. In the decades that followed, Germans would point to the airlift as the moment when the post-war relationship between Germany and the Western Allies truly began, when occupation started transforming into partnership. But for the individuals who had experienced the airlift directly, particularly those who had served in the German military, the story remained complicated and personal. They had witnessed American capability and generosity, had been saved by the same nation they had fought, had seen their own military traditions exposed as inadequate for modern warfare. These were not comfortable realizations, but they were necessary ones for understanding both what Germany had been and what it might become. In the final accounting, the airlift delivered 2.3 million tons of supplies to Berlin over 15 months, more than 1 ton for every resident of the city. 78 people died in the operation, 31 Americans, 39 British, and 8 Germans casualties of crashes and accidents that were inevitable in such an intensive operation. It was a modest price compared to the hundreds of thousands who would have starved or frozen had the airlift failed. The aircraft that flew the missions, primarily American C-54s and British Dakotas, became symbols of hope for an entire generation of Berliners. The sound of their engines, the sight of their wings against the sky, represented the possibility of survival in a world that seemed determined to crush the city. And for the Americans and British who flew them, the missions represented something equally important: the possibility that military power could be used for purposes other than destruction, that the same capabilities developed for war could be turned to saving lives in peace. When the last airlift mission landed at Tempelhof on September 30th, 1949, it marked the end of an operation that had accomplished something unprecedented in military history, but it also marked the beginning of a new relationship between former enemies, a relationship built on the pragmatic recognition that their futures were bound together in ways that transcended the hatreds of the recent past. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.